Welcome to this webinar. I forgot, what do we call this?
What is a CISO?
What is the CISO is the topic today. So thanks, Matthew, for coming. I really appreciate it. Before we started in the pre-show banter, I was talking about, we were talking about sort of like the joy of doing these things and how as you do more, they get easy. And for me, it's a joy to just hang out with my friends. And that's Matthew and, the people who came today. And so I want to I want to express my gratitude for that. Now, a couple of things, few announcements. One, the last in this week's series on WTF as a CISO anyway is going to go out tomorrow. If you haven't seen those articles, there's one that went out every morning starting on Sunday. So that's on the Nearshore Cyber newsletter. Subscribe. It feeds my ego. It's nice. So the last one will be tomorrow. It'll be a little bit of a wrap up. Another thing, on Tuesday, I am going to be co-presenting with Harness, with Adam Ariano of Harness, about overwhelm, about the overdraft. It was actually, he invited me because of the original paper on that, which is about how do we cope with all the stuff that AI is throwing our way, which is mostly really great. Like, yeah, there's slop, but a lot of it is really great. How do we create boundaries in our own heads and lives and organizations so we can solve it or survive it? And yeah, now, as for this one, here's where it came from. I have a thing called Aramis, and Aramis is a assessment platform mostly for technical skills. So we can assess things like how do you do if you're in a cybersecurity engineering job or a GRC analyst job or a detection engineering job. But I didn't have CISO on the list, not because I didn't think it was valuable, but because I didn't really know how to frame it. And even though I've had the job, like I never felt like I was really qualified. Maybe I never was. But the definition of what a CISO is, to me, always seemed to be highly problematic, especially when it comes to my recruiting business, because at the same time I was going through that, and Matthew and I were having conversations about how assessment works, I was recruiting for fractional CISO for a role with a certain client. And I put the word out to 350 of my first level connections on LinkedIn. Anybody who had vCISO, and if you're one of them, thank you for replying. I got 120 applications, and the rate was really low. Really low. And many of the people who were applying were folks who, like a year or two ago, would have laughed at anything at that rate. They were charging like 3 times what this rate was. And I had conversations with them because I do a lot of interviews. I do my own tech interviews, my own long interviews. And what I realized is that the vCISO business and also the CISO business is in the doldrums at best. And started to think about what went wrong. And I started asking people what went wrong. And I think, Matthew, you're probably better able to address the question of like, what even is the role and where's it going than anybody else. So all that said, who are you? Please give us your intro.
Sure. So I've been around in the cybersecurity industry, and thank you very much for being here. I'm actually thrilled to be here, but I've been around the industry for roughly 30 years. I have been through CISO roles. I have been in a variety of things from, government cybersecurity, doing FISMA. I've done high trust. I've done all these different frameworks and things like that. And I've bounced around and learned a lot. So I'm a person who's been in 3 different roles, CISO roles, and including the global chief information security officer role. I've built enterprise risk management for companies. I've brought in cyber risk quantification in various forms for different companies. I've done all kinds of things. So then I decided, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and start on my own because I want to solve all these governance challenges and the issues related to the CISO, which many people are aware of. And so I decided to found my own company, Cyvergence, which in a nutshell, what I'm doing is I'm bridging business and cybersecurity. And I mean that very seriously. I think that's one of the big misses from a CISO perspective because we don't have the appropriate level of communication. And so that's what I'm doing now.
Assuming it is true that the market for CISOs and particularly vCISOs is in the dumps right now. What are the reasons? Like, so there are going to be a lot of people here who I know for sure are like, yeah, I'm here to figure out why I can't get work or why I'm only able to bill a third or a quarter of what I used to. What's happening?
So I think there's a bunch of different things. I do think a lot of the CISOs that are in their positions are maintaining their positions. I am seeing a lot of CISOs losing their jobs though. And I have seen, especially after the whole nonsense with Tim Brown, et cetera, a lot of CISOs left. And so I think there's a lot of fear and agitation and things like that that are causing a lot of issues. I am seeing some people get new jobs in the CISO role, but I think that on a certain level, the people that are more experienced are saying, I don't want the job anymore because of the problems that are there. Now I'm working with people to try to change that whole relationship they have with the business, with IT, and with the broader perspective. But I think those are challenges that businesses have too. A lot of businesses are fed up with CISOs, because they don't understand who they are. They don't understand what function they have. They don't understand how to communicate with the CISOs and vice versa. I do a lot of communication work too with companies, just trying to create that communication barrier and get past it so people understand what is a CISO. So I think because we're seeing the problems from a business side, and also the other thing I'm seeing is a lot of CISOs being pulled up from the middle. And what happens is, and this is a general problem in IT and in cybersecurity, they people get people they like and they're technical, but they don't have any leadership training, don't have any leadership background, and they say, "You're now the CISO." And that's a problem that's way beyond CISOhood. In American companies, you find a lot of companies that say, "You know what? You're really good at Active Directory. You're now the Active Directory manager." And
Yeah.
just because you're good technically doesn't mean that you're very good from a leadership perspective. It doesn't mean that you can communicate with the business leaders. And I think because of these sorts of things, except for in regulated industries where you have to have a CISO or have to have some of them, companies are moving away from that because the very nature of the CISO role, we have something called assurance, where we go check to validate are things done. Classic example is vulnerability management. We go validate it, we check it, and we say, "Hey, Houston, we got a problem here. Let's try to do that." And that's where you get all these types of things. That is a function that is an irritant to IT. They don't want to hear about any of this stuff. "Hey, I got too much stuff to do," throwing out all this kind of things, and that creates a challenge in the CISO role, and they get tired of it. I know CISOs that have taken on the operational functions of IT, but left the engineering function to the CIO, specifically because the business has been very frustrated with it. Hopefully that answers a little bit. It's not the entire
Yeah.
thing, but it provides a little bit of light about what's going on in the background, at least what I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time we talk, I wind up with more questions than answers, but that's great. I mean, I mean, the great thing about cyber is that at least it used to welcome people who would ask the questions. I don't know if it does anymore, but let's talk about, where it starts, where it is now, where it's going. In the first article that I posted last Sunday, I mentioned the Steve Katz, who was the first person to wield the title. It's pretty short, by the way. The articles are like they're 2-minute reads. But the long and the short of it is what? Do you want to tell the Katz story for your understanding of it,
Yeah, I mean,
City?
well, Steve Katz, he was working over at another company. He got hired in to Citigroup, Citibank, or for those who are not familiar with it. Basically, he was started leading that function, and trying to deal with all the challenges related to cybersecurity because they didn't have anybody who was focused on it. So a consulting group came in and said, "Hey, we need somebody." And he didn't know all the stuff related to cybersecurity at the time. It wasn't a discipline where we've started to define it over a period of time. It was a completely new function. So he was really one of the trailblazers at the time to really start push that CISO function forward.
Yeah, I got my start at City as part of Steve's budget. I never met him. By all accounts, he was a great guy and really super smart. But he was also a bit dropped into. I mean, City Corp at the time. City Corp, Travelers, someone was Barney come together. That's how you get City Group. City Corp was a very hard place to work, and it was complex and had a certain bureaucracy, but also a kind of an entrepreneurial edge. So it made sense that he was there. But we had a team that was at once building a Unix security model and identity access management. And I was building a SOC, all under the same weird little group in Newcastle, Delaware. Right, and it was happening right just before the Euro, which is not eternal despite how people's short attention spans, and then Y2K, which by the way we did a great job with, which is why your stuff kept working, everyone. But my point is like, yeah, we were all making it up as we went along. Then I'm sure Steve And by the way, if you knew him personally, like, please chime in. Like, want to hear from you. I'm sure that he was doing then what a lot of us are doing now. Have we made all that much progress since, what was it, 1995?
For me personally, absolutely. And so here's how the way I kind of look at this stuff. If you go back, and I'm going to imagine a little bit back then in 1995, but it's largely a technical function. Then eventually, that's when he had SAS 70 as an audit framework before the SOC 2, where you try to meet the controls that you say that you're meeting in your own policies and procedures. That's a very simplistic form of cybersecurity. Yeah, it's firewalls, it's antivirus, it's identity. You had some basics of SOC that was in there. I've actually, in my old days, I was using Swatch to analyze firewalls and things like that prior to, yeah, exactly. But we were able to pass audits, get things done in the old days. But at any rate, some of the other things that would come in, then you end up with the compliance oriented CISO. These are CISOs that are, hey, now we got to meet SOC 2. Hey, let's meet ISO 27K. And you're getting these standards that are coming around. And I'm going to jump on the standards for a quick tangent here. Now we're seeing the acceleration of standards faster than I've ever seen them. Take AI. How quickly was it before the first AI standard came out there? That was fast. That had to be within like 6 months of some of the stuff. And yes, they've needed to evolve since then because now we've got agentic and all this other stuff. But the frameworks are moving faster and faster and faster to keep up with the new challenges, and things are beginning to accelerate. I think that's good. That's the industry stepping in. That's a huge win over what we had back in 1995. Then we ended up kind of an evolution where you're getting that risk-oriented CISO. These are the ones like, hey, well, let's start to get some risk in it. We had the simplistic forms of risk management. Hey, what's likelihood and impact? Yeah. And we're going to have
With the
critical.
red up at the top and the green at the bottom. I mean, you do that, you're done, right?
Well, for back then, that was true. And I was doing stuff in federal security, 20 years ago or whatever. I was doing stuff like that. Now I know a whole lot better, but back then that's where I was when I was first starting to learn about this stuff. I was going for the NIST RMF and some of the early things and NIST 853, et cetera. But that's kind of where things are at. And then you've got, you get this larger oriented CISO that's starting to grow. This is where you get the privacy, you get legal, you get all these other things that are starting to grow in that framework. Now the CISOs are being more broad and starting to connect a little bit more. But here's what I think ultimately came out of that. So we're looking at that slow evolution is you ended up with a business oriented CISO. This is where I talk about that bridging business and cybersecurity. To me, that's a very height of where CISO should be evolving towards, where they have been. The problem is many businesses haven't evolved that quickly. A lot of businesses still see that as an IT function. And that's
Yeah,
the problem.
you posted something the other day to which about the CISO being like a dancer, and I responded, yeah, like trying to do tango in a mosh pit.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It was weeks ago. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and which had me thinking about. I mean, there's the CISO role, and then there are the people who do it, and then the organizations in which they work in like a geopolitical, economic, technological context, and pull any one of those out or break it, and the whole thing becomes really hard to manage. And there's always one of those things that's broken. But the thing that seems to be a perennial problem is the status of CISO as C-level executive, which gets you things like, because they're a C, they need to report to the CEO, and I've done that. It's like it's not special, I have in many places, like when I was at Optiv, my top was like director of something. I still went to the CEO when I wanted to, and he was happy to see me. And there are VPs who couldn't get it, couldn't get the time of day out of them. But I wonder, if you could talk to what does it mean to be a C-level executive?
So I think there's a lot of things that go into that when you talk about that. Like one of the posts I put out months ago was something called the Cheeto. Imagine Cheetos in the background. It's the chief in title only. And I think that's a huge problem with a lot of organizations, especially because, I mentioned that security can be a little bit of an irritation to IT. Hey, we don't want to hear stuff that's going on. And especially if you're reporting into managers like a CIO or CTO, depending on the organization, that's a big problem. You've got a conflict of interest there that goes on. So if they don't want to give you budget for things, and I have run into organizations that have done all kinds of fancy things, but they want to protect the narrative. I like one of the terms I like to use quite often, and one of the things that I talk about deeply in my next generation CISO course is the dark triad. But a lot of people start to take on the dark triad as they start to go up in power and they feel the force of that from the rest of the business. And that creates sort of a dichotomy where it's all about protecting the power and not open to new ideas. You don't have that psychological safety in many organizations. Like talking about your vulnerabilities is a very good thing to do in most leadership positions. That's in a perfect world. We don't
When
live
you,
in a perfect
yeah,
world. And
yeah.
so that to me is part of the problems when you're talking about. So when you talk about what makes a CISO a real C-level executive, to get down to your question, it's you've got to have the authority. Hey, I need some help. Can I get an hire an additional person or do something like that without having that filtered all the way through other people who are going to be making the decisions for you and going to be making those decisions. That's one angle of what makes a CISO. To me, that independence is important. So getting something separate from the technology risks, from the people doing the work is absolutely critical in many organizations. Now, I've seen it where it works perfectly, don't get me wrong, but those are few and far between compared to the people that are protecting their narrative. And so that's a challenge that has to be met, has to be thought about. So I would say owning your own budget and being able to make decisions, especially when foundational issues are going on, that's a big part of it. Being able to call out risks. Like I have seen people you don't want to list any risks out there because of X, Y, and Z reasons. I'm protecting my narrative. So risk management gets watered down if you can't even communicate. And a lot of this has to do with basic governance processes. And I think a lot of organizations don't set up the processes well. They don't think about it. You don't understand the accountability. You don't understand ownership. And a lot of people find that boring. And if you can't engage in those conversations, that's important. But to me, it's also that translation because you talked about reporting into a CEO. It depends on the CEO that you're working with. Like I've once worked with a CEO. He used to be a CIO. You know what? We spoke largely the same language. I didn't need to change my language at all. A lot of others, you need to have a different way of communicating. You've got to communicate with them. You've got to have a different way of looking at things to get beyond that Cheeto status, the chief and title only. So
Mhm.
to me, those are some fundamental building blocks of being able to create a better leader. You've got to be able to communicate with people. Otherwise, you're out. You can be out quickly in many cases if you can't communicate. And that's the big problem. A lot of CEOs, they just don't have time. They don't pay attention to it. And of course, this is going to depend on the organization. You talk to a 6-person organization, some of these CEOs, they've got all the time in the world and they're talking to you and you develop a good relationship with. But if you can't develop a good relationship with your executives or the board of directors or others and can't learn to speak their language, that's an issue. So those are things that I think are foundational to getting beyond that title only. And there's a lot more to it, but that's
One of the great things about security is we get to poke our noses into everybody's business. It's kind of like GRC, especially. Like if you want to find the person who understands how a company works, like no one will understand every piece of it. The CEO should have the complete top level view, but depth not so much. Maybe they micromanage in product, or maybe they micromanage in sales and they get into the field. But it seems like the people who have the most comprehensive and best structured view are the people who do GRC, particularly the ones who work like a combination of like I think like ISO stuff and maybe Sarbanes-Oxley, right? If you have both of them, you're pretty well covered. But actually, let me take us in another direction. So there are great CISOs who do okay in shitty organizations. I'm going to curse, by the way, so whatever.
I don't mind.
Cool. Well, the audience, they know me. So they're like you have their great CISOs who can do okay in okay organizations and might be all right in shitty ones. Then you have good companies with good teams where a mediocre CISO can get by and maybe even a bad one for a little while. And then you have the bad CISO in the great organization. This is like I'm doing the David Spark, which is what's worse thing out now. which is your best? Like, which would you rather have? Individual, great, mediocre, weak, strong org?
For me, I'd
Or
rather
what
have the
combination? Like, I probably screwed it up. I think I just did 6.
That's okay. I mean, like for me though, it's having great culture, great people. I will take that any day of the week. I don't care. Like if it also these things always depend because you have to look at the organizational structure. Like I know one organization, they don't fire anybody unless they're causing physical harm to somebody. And when you start to look at that, that can change the culture so drastically. And you could say, hey, it starts here, but those things can deteriorate very quickly. When you get into organizational design, you take a look at accountability and ownership, that can start to deteriorate cultures so quickly. And the good people come in and then they bounce out quickly. So it does depend on the context. It depends on the situation. You can walk into a mediocre organization and change it around, but sometimes it's very difficult depending on the people, the power structure, the way they look at things, how they handle things, etc. But then you got to take a look at the causes of those. Like, for example, I was talking to somebody recently. They might be bringing into this as an opportunity to help deal with their leadership issue. What happened was they got one of those dark triad individuals. It's really messed up. I will just briefly go over it. Narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, invented in 2002. That's tough. When you deal with those kind of people and they're above you, that can be a huge challenge for anybody in the industry. And when they're above you in the pecking order, they're sometimes going to be right. Sometimes you can shield versus that, sometimes not. Like a buddy of mine is working at a very large organization that everybody here is familiar with, and he lost almost all of his staff because the person above him, they liked him personally, but they didn't like the person above him. And so they all split. So it looks like he's a bad CISO, or I guess CIO in that particular case. But when you look at those are big challenges for organizations. So trying to come in and say, which would you prefer? I want to get into the specifics. I would rather have better executive support than I would the support down here. But you have to make sure that you've got the organization set up properly to challenge that and challenge, hey, maybe we can make some changes. Let's have some conversations.
I'm reminded of some of the best security organizations that I've known were actually part of companies that were more broadly crap or okay or problematic.
It can happen. Yeah.
And there's another, I mean, dark triad aside, what about the positive? Like, and one of the things that I found works is the pirate captain, where gosh, I'm trying to remember. Well, actually, David Bonvillain at Acuvan had his crew, and they were called Attack and Pen or something like that. And everybody felt special. And like that wasn't a mediocre organization; it was a terrific company. But everybody knew that like sales could screw things up, and there was a technical services organization that was not like them in ops. And so, like Bonvillain created this crew, and it's a model I've seen in other places like IO Active. It's very explicit about the pirate crew. How do you create? I mean, that's one way to create sort of to run the security organization well, despite suboptimal circumstances. What are some other ways for the CISO to lead and manage a team just when budget's not there? Maybe everybody hates you. They think you just fix typewriters for a living. That's what they call this. I think they
Sure.
call us that at Citi. We were the security for the typewriter repairman.
Yeah. So there's a lot to go into that. Can be a full discussion for an hour just on its own to determine what's going to be successful. To me, it's about creating connections. The first thing that you have to do, and I'm so big on the concept of trust. How do you build trust across organizations? And how do you build trust across people? If you don't build that trust, that's where a lot of the challenges come in first. So you have to start with trust above all else. Now, I will say, and everybody's seen the articles, you can get the bad apple that's in there. Sometimes you do need to get rid of the bad apple. That's, dark triad, they're the bad apple, get rid of them. But then you can start to build that. And a lot of that has to do with creating, you know, like Satya Nadella, when he first jumped into Microsoft as the CEO, The company was not going anywhere. It had Azure in place, but they weren't focusing on it. They had a lot of different personality issues. You had people running around as know-it-alls. People weren't communicating with one another. And so what he was doing is like, let's create a learning culture. Let's create foster a culture of curiosity. And also let's talk about things where where they're paid based on their cooperation, not on this competitive landscape, because they created everything in a competitive fashion.
They had the Jack Welch GE like stack ranking where they cut the bottom whatever percent every year or something. I
Yeah.
don't know. I think they got rid of that. I don't know if that stayed gotten rid of.
I'd have to look into that further.
But that was part of the damage done to the culture was from that
Yeah.
thing, and it was just I mean it came out of like this. I mean it usually works for a couple of quarters, and then it doesn't
It
anymore.
can, but it creates some challenges when you start to do that. Like some places are so toxic. I'm gonna pick on a very specific organization, Volkswagen. The engineers, what they did is started lying on the stuff saying, "Yep, the car's great," but then they go in for the emissions test after everything, and they were trying to blame
Yeah.
the engineers, but the engineers were like, well, they were giving us impossible to define metrics and all these other things that were going on. It was really the leader's fault. It wasn't the engineer's fault because you created a toxic atmosphere. So you have to be able to like part of what to me is important are things like active listening. And that means a lot of different things. Sometimes that means how do you listen to people? Are you asking questions? A lot of people think, yeah, I heard it. Yeah, I got active listening down. Yeah, I'm good to go. You don't have active listening down. You need to listen to the people around you. Now, the challenge is the more toxic the organization, it is trickier and trickier to really understand what is toxic information coming in and not. So you've got to learn to navigate those types of things. You've got to figure out who your trusted advisors are and who are going to tell you the truth. Because as you go up that iceberg of ignorance, as you've seen before, you've got to learn how to listen to people and listen to people well. And that is such an important trait for changing things around because you don't know who to trust. And especially when you throw in, all the behaviors that happen to you as a result and other people too, understanding that is important. But, how can you help people achieve their goals? The servant leadership is such an important part of any good leader for changing the culture around. And part of this, how are you paid? You're helping me get more bonus? Cool. Now, sometimes that's very problematic. That very simple question. So, for example, let's say
Mm.
the CIO is trying to get things done. And if they get all these projects done, they're going to get a bonus of, maybe 200,000 or 500,000 for the CIO. And they're like, great, I'm fantastic. Then the security person comes in there. Hey, but you forgot all this stuff. You become an irritant. That is a system that's built and working against the CISO. And so when you're talking about culture, what are the incentives that are behind the people that are making those decisions? Sometimes is a much larger issue than just the CISO. And so when you start to look at things and you start to look at cultures, it's an interesting conversation. Like I know one major organization, it's in the financial services industry, but their GRC program apparently destroyed the relationship between IT and security.
Hmm.
And everybody I believe was trying to do their jobs, but I think I didn't get that far into it, but it sounded like it had to do with the incentives that were there, if I had to guess. Because if you're gonna lose $100,000 because the security team reported something, I don't want them to see it. And that's a big challenge within organizations. I mean, that's one of the layers of challenges. And the other side is communication. Like I was talking with another, I'm going to call him a CISO, but their chief compliance officer was trying to, they would ask a question of, so what? And the IT team would sit there and go, but 9.0 CVE, work on it, and they wouldn't know how to communicate. So learning to communicate, learning to speak the language of somebody else is one of the other ways that you can do to change that culture. And once you listen to them, you got to listen to them on a personal level first, gain
Yeah.
their trust. And when you gain their trust and you pull it back in, you're going to do a lot better. So talk to your CFO, talk to your CEO, your COO, et cetera.
Yeah.
All of these are incredibly important.
One of the things I love about working in places like Mexico, where for the few people who don't know, that's where I live and try and do business. People really do take time and listen, like a lot. to the point where it gets on my nerves. But I've learned from that that you always start with things like, how was your week? Not just how was your weekend, but tell me about your kids. Tell me about your family. Um, Something that is not in the office. And when people say you can't talk about personal stuff, they're like, well, what are we going to talk about that matters then? The weather? No one cares unless, whatever, And so one of the things you have to be willing to do is break little rules like you don't talk about personal. Fine, talk about politics, but you don't talk about who's in the White House and you don't talk about abortion.
Yeah, yeah. There's
Like they're like
some limits
they're
there.
like
You don't want to
I learned that,
treat
yeah, I
people
learned
that are doing this.
yeah, I
Yeah.
learned that from a PMI, like a PMP class. And he said, just never talk about the president or abortion. Everything else is pretty much cool, but do talk about pets
Yeah.
and the books behind you, which I still haven't seen close up. But so if I was thinking about the problem of visibility and truth, and this is actually not something that I don't think this came up in the writing. It A lot of us get into security and thrive here because we are habitual truth tellers. Some of that goes sideways when we think that we have the truth and we really don't. But we have the questions. And when people are trying to do good in an organization where they don't understand what's going on, they wind up asking the wrong questions. And I was thinking about, do you remember Richard Clark? Yeah, he was like
A little bit.
White House cyber czar or something like that. And I think he came from the intelligence community, and there was a wonderful 60 minutes about him 20 years ago or something, where they were sort of introducing him and what he was working on and why. And he said that when he took the job, the first thing he did was say, okay, I'm responsible for securing the internet, right? They said, yes. And he said, then show it to me. They're like, what do you mean? Like, we can't show you the internet. He's like, it exists in the world. It must be possible to see it. And see, he went to May West and May East. He went to the big network access. I forgot. I think it's Naps or something like that. If somebody is from the WAN world, please give me the right term in the chat. And he talked about how he could see the cables and get a sense of what it was about. But no one had. I've actually been to May West just by happenstance because it had low latency to Ticketmaster or whatever it was in those days. But if you're a CISO, how often do you go on a sales call for whatever the company sells? The best CFO I know, I won't name him because he already knows he's the best. I would see him operate as a stand-in for the CEO and do better. And I think the CEO would agree too, that this guy was great. And not only did he understand the numbers and the finances, but he understood the company's mission from a customer's and a partner's perspective. I mean, is that so? I want to know more about, and I think a lot of people want to know more about what you're doing with Cyvergence and like, what kind of people are you working with? By the way, this is like the 10-minute wrap up. So
Sure.
what kind of people are you trying to help? And what is your approach? And then how do they leave the program transformed?
So it depends because there's a lot of different programs that I do and a lot of different approaches that I'm using. I mean, when I look at it, so bridging business and cybersecurity is sort of that key thread, but the approach I'm using is helping to create better leaders. That's with my leadership exchange. It's also with my becoming the next generation CISO course. I've also got a course for training executives and boards so they understand the why. I've got a opportunity in the works where I'm going to just go around and work with the government and others just to educate them on that why, because they don't get it. So better leaders, better decisions. Like I'm a big fan of risk management and governance, and most companies don't do governance properly. And there's larger ones that I think do far better than others. There's definitely a whole range that's out there. So some are doing good, but if you put them aside for a minute, that's where I think the other challenge is. They don't like part of the quantification and the enterprise risk management and all this other stuff that I help build for organizations. That's critical. Like just today, somebody was posting some stuff today on a company that I was working with, Arcova, where I would help build their enterprise risk management function. I help build them by talking to them, learning about them, and asking questions. Very small organization, two major people and a lot of technical people in the background. That's it. You could build ERM for a small company and they really appreciate it. I started getting into their P90 risk. I started getting into some others. So I work everything from small companies to mid-sized companies. I will work with individuals who have not been in cyber, that are looking to go in that direction all the way through that. So I'm, coaching CISOs. I'm doing some other things along those lines, but I'm also building a lot of programs. Like I've got a new program that's going into beta test soon to help people understand that whole relationship of risk quantification. Where does risk quantification go awry? That could be a whole discussion I could spend an hour on and have in the past talking about the problems. So if you look at it and how do you communicate? So many CISOs, well, give me the easy button, click, and I've quantified the risk. And then they go talk to the CFO and they're like, what is this? And
Mm.
that's a problem because they don't respect it. They don't understand it. It's alien. And the CISO can't explain it. And they're spending, lots of money on these programs and they just look like an idiot because they haven't sat down from a business perspective. And so a lot of what I do is get that buy-in from a business standpoint in the risk assessment process and build something that's going to stand the test of time. If you're in a board meeting and somebody's saying, when you're up there trying to present these facts as important and true, oh, look at them, they're like this, and they're like, you have lost a massive amount of credibility with the board. You've lost a massive amount of credibility with everybody else. That credibility that you earn as a CISO is absolutely critical. So when I talk about bridging business and cybersecurity, it does mean working with the cyber leaders to educate others, but it also means educating the business at the same time. A lot of CEOs, you take a look back in 2016, there was a report that was out there. How many programs actually required learning about cybersecurity? Very few. I'm educating business leaders how to communicate with IT and cyber. That's critical. So when you talk about what I do, it's very broad by using a lot of the same tools, but I use it with different groups of people.
So let's land on the future. There's this
One other
thing
thing,
called, oh
one
yeah,
other thing
okay.
too, I help build better organizations, and that's just all this basic cyber stuff, resilience too. But anyway, now you can go ahead.
Well, you're still a practitioner, like you're
Yeah,
still
absolutely. I
CISOing.
do some vCISO work. I do some.
But by the way, I met Matthew's team at B&H long before I met Matthew, and I showed up biased in when it came to you because they had great things to say. So like Matthew's the real deal, and it came from his folks, and they were interesting people. Let's put it that way. But okay, so there's this thing called AI, and if we don't talk about it, somebody docks my pay. The I mean, AI had a begin. I mean, sorry, the CISO had a beginning in around 1995, at least in terms of the title, and a big fat budget for Steve, rest his soul. And now it is 19. Okay, so math for me. 31 years. 31 years later, 1 year longer than my cyber career. It's not what it once was. I don't know that it ever was what people wanted it to think it was. But what's next? Like, does it? I mean, regulated industries, like certain industries, have to have somebody with the title CISO, but it doesn't have to be real. Other organizations have functionally somebody is a CISO because they're the topmost person in the organization for cyber. They make the cyber decisions generally, and they can sign stuff that makes them an officer. And they do information security. A lot of the time, they have other jobs too, like they run a bunch of IT or they do endpoint. Uh, I know some that are lawyers or consultants. Like Eric Bowman is one. He's a lawyer turned cybersecurity consultant. Brilliant, right? Great perspective. But like, does the CISO role matter much anymore? And is that why like those rates were going down?
I think some has to do with the economy. Whether you like it or not, we're in a place where things are a little bit iffy right now without getting into politics. But what happens is with companies, they pull back and they don't want to spend as much based on the situation. I've heard some rumblings here and there. I've seen a little bit where some boards aren't interested in cyber, but you've got to take a look at the makeup of the board, the makeup of the people. I know a lot of business leaders are just frustrated. They don't know what to do with cyber. They know that it's important. They'd rather have IT do it. There is a certain relief being out of the full-time role. Like I will never report into a technical function within a business. Again, as a CISO, even when I'm doing consulting, I make those kind of choices. But that's where that irritation comes in. But at the same time, what I'm seeing is a lot of companies, and I've seen this personally, where, yep, we've got vulnerability management. We're patching every single month and we're getting stuff done. We're great. And the amount of vulnerabilities is just going up like this. I've seen it over a billion from some sources. Now, That's just negligence, even though it looks like on paper, but what's happening behind the scenes. So everybody wants to look good and say, hey, I'm wonderful. Did I tell you how great I am today? I'm really, really good. You know, but the problem is when you do that, what are you sweeping behind the curtain? And that's a big problem in organizations. When you talk about what's the role of security, it's the assurance. If you don't have a separate team looking at that, who's going to be looking at that? Because when you have like it owned by the IT team and they're looking at it, they get dumped on more stuff. What can I sweep under the carpet? We can hide all this other vulnerability stuff. And that to me is one of the big issues that you see in cybersecurity today. So security is important. They might get rid of the role,
Mhm.
but some people find it inconvenient. But on the other hand, it's such a critical function that you need to go build in that. Now, if you take a look at, I can do case study after case study after case study on what's happened with different roles. A lot of times they hire people for, I'm going to say this, are you going to be the yes man for me? Like take change healthcare.
Mhm.
The CISO that was in there had never had 1 day of experience as a CISO.
Oh, yeah, that one.
Yes, that was Senator, Wyden going after Change Healthcare, and he was just tearing up
Well,
the.
yeah, and he was the guy was new. He was like a market farm, like he was from the industry, but it was like he was a fast riser and he was like really savvy. But let's face it, that's easy to do in security because I mean there are a lot of people who want those jobs, but a lot of people don't want those jobs. Like in a big
Yeah,
way, don't want those jobs. And so they become like the role, like the empty slot becomes vulnerable to cronyism. Right.
absolutely.
It's like you remember the music, the Broadway musical, How to Succeed at Business Without Really Trying?
I've heard of it, no I don't know it.
Watch it, watch it. It's actually pretty good. I won't give away. I'm just gonna give away because you won't watch it. So there's this part in the play where the guy gets promoted. He comes up from the mailroom and he gets promoted into the job of the vice president of advertising, which everyone knows is a catastrophe but him. And it's one of these jobs where you can't succeed. There's no way to succeed at it. You cannot. You will. The VP of advertising never gets promoted. It's got a glass ceiling built in, and you're probably going to get fired in like months. And I mean, and I think it depends on the organization, but a lot of the time it has to do with the fact that plenty of CISOs don't really know how to be a C, or that's usually the main thing. But I think AI, and I do want to touch on this a little bit before we drop in a couple of minutes. AI creates an emergency, and with every emergency, something emerges. That's in the word emerge. What can we do if we play our cards right, our AI cards and our CISO cards? How can we make things? How can CISOs make things better? And how can we make things better for the CISO?
So I think there's a lot of different tricks out there. I mean, in my CISO course, I probably cover 70 different ways of influencing people, but let's put those aside for a minute and try to make it simple. To me, like when I do risk, I like to look at things from scenario perspective. And so when you start to bring in legal, you start to like legal has to be your friend. I'm a very big on getting legal there. And you start to bring in some of the CFO, the CRO, and you start talking about these scenarios. It is amazing what can come up with those scenarios. And people respect you. You don't come in there with all the answers. Hey, what would happen if this, legally speaking? I heard about this particular case, but you let the chief legal officer or general counsel, whoever they're called for the organization, run with that and come up with the answers for that. That's fantastic. Uh, that's something where you can start to build credibility. You don't know everything. You're not coming in, let me tell you what's going to happen to you. Let me tell you the impact, which is the approach a lot of CISOs take towards risk management. Oh, no, I saw this in cyber insurance. I know this is your risk. You better go along with it.
Yeah.
You know, those are really dated tools that are out there. So AI, getting people involved in that discussion and saying, what's the likelihood? What's going on? Let's take a look at this. But the challenge is there's an alternate narrative that's going on. Before the show, we were talking about PE firm, for example. And some of the PE and VC firms, and I'm not joking about this, they're saying, you're an AI or you're dead to me. So imagine the stress that's
I'm on board with
hidden.
that. I'm seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The stress is there on the CEO. So like, do AI, do AI. How many are introducing financial discipline into the approach. A lot of CISOs are not doing that. No, we got to meet this. We got to do this. Here's my massive budget. You know, but include some financial discipline. In more than one organization, I've gotten rid of tools and said, that's really not providing you with any value. And here's why. And here's my experience where that comes from. You see all kinds of things that are out there. This seems like a reasonable person. They're getting rid of stuff that isn't valued. And one of them, I think it is valuable, but not for the maturity of the people, processes, and that you've got. So get rid of the technology till you do bring up the people and the processes, and then you can start to add to it. You've got to take a look at the context. You've got to understand the people. You've got to understand what's going on. And you're going to develop enemies for trying to be reasonable and getting rid of things that are so valuable. But like in one company, oh, if we only did this, this would have been valuable. Nobody's moving in that direction. We need to get people moving in the same direction first. People talk a lot about culture, but you go in for the standard interview, most people don't understand culture. They talk about it, but if you don't understand what that means and how to change that and what those processes are, to me, those are executive level skills that you have to have when walking into an organization. The challenge is when you've got that Cheeto title and you're seen as the technical person, well, the PSS score is at least 8.7. You you've lost respect. I'm doing a little geeky here on purpose, I know.
No. Well, I mean,
But
you're a culture geek. Like we're all geeks in our own way.
yes,
We're all technical in our own way, and then there are people
yeah,
who are like, don't be technical about computers. I'm like, but you are technical as hell about your accounting thing, or your sales methodology,
yes,
or your
yep.
your engine, your robotics, or whatever the hell you do for a living. Like everyone's. And I think it's a matter of not just like accepting what other people are being geeky about, but going back to what's natural for cybersecurity professionals, which is to care about it and want to understand it. That is the one thing that we can always win on, curiosity.
See, I agree with you, but a lot
What?
of people don't want to be curious
A lot
about
of
those types of things.
yeah, a lot of people. I'm going to say it. There are people in this business who need to get the fuck out. Because if you're not excited by the world and the opportunities to learn what other people do and how you can subvert and all that stuff, like you're not doing yourself or us any favors by sticking around. And like the world, like there are plenty of jobs that need to be done that would benefit from the skills that you tried to learn as a CISO or Sky, blah, blah, blah. But you just don't be here. Can we, we're about out of time. I think we came full circle in this, at least in a rhyming sense, from what is a CISO to what is culture. And you're an actual master of that. I'm not making that shit up. And maybe we can do something about that. Master Matthew Webster, I love you. Thank you so much for being here today. And it was so much fun putting this together. If people want to get a hold of you, how?
So I've got a website, www.cyvergence, CYVEERGENC.biz, B-I-Z. I am all over LinkedIn. That's a great way to get hold of me there. Also, if people want to email me, it's Matthew with two T's, obviously, Webster. It's cyvergence.biz is another way. But yeah, I'm all over the place. Just look for me. I'm around in New York. I go to different events and things like that. So you'll see me around. Happy to have conversations with people. You know, we can go from there. Thank you. And it's been fun on this show. So thank you very much, Peter. I really appreciated it.
Yes, awesome. And I'll see you on TikTok. All right, I'm going to shut it down. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.